what I'd like to do tonight in part one of this series is go over lead, acute versus chronic, organic versus inorganic, where you get it, where it goes, just the basics, and then give you the resources where you can go and get more information than at the best sites. I've been doing treatments for lead for probably about 15 years. And in Galveston County, we have a big problem with lead. Even the veterinarians have a problem with their animals in lead because of all the historical and the petrochemical activity we have down here. So this is, and it's probably one of the 2 or 3 treatments that really help people in an internal medicine practice. And so tonight we'll start with what I thought was the coolest title of an article in Circulation back in 2006, Lead, Silent Killer in the U.S. Lead is an element. It's a soft metal. Although we call organic versus inorganic lead, there's nothing organically good about lead. There's nothing in the body that it does. It's rather a misnomer to call them the heavy metals. The heavy metals are the toxic metals, and they tend to be like lead, cadmium, mercury, and this whole group of metals. But there isn't really a chemical group called the heavy metals. It's been mentioned as far back as the Bible in Exodus. Thou didst blow with thy wind, the sea covered them, and they sank as lead in the mighty waters. Again, it's heavier than water. It's from Latin plumum for soft metals. That's the Pb. And that's what a bar of lead looks like. Not quite a gold bar, but it's a lead bar. Now, the best lead publications prior to the 90s is a series of, it's a big book. It's about 2 inches thick, and it's edited by Castellino brothers and Sinolo. And it's everything that's ever been published about lead up until about the time of the normative aging studies and in Haynes. If anybody ever wants to borrow it, I'll mail it to them. I mean, it has everything ever published about lead. The other 2 sources that are the most valuable in the U.S. are the Haynes, which is the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey that's done every couple of years by the CDC. It uses blood levels of lead when it's doing its reports. The other major lead effort the last 20 years is the normative aging study, which was started in the 60s, looking at men between 21 and 80 in Boston and following every form of aging that occurred. And in the 1990s, they started publishing on lead in bone. They came up with a K-shell kind of bone density machine, and they were able to measure lead in trabecular and cortical bone. And the studies on that show us how even though lead is no longer in your blood, 95% of it is in your bone. And so these are very important epidemiological studies. And this is bone lead through the ages. If you look at the first molar, which is the most indicative of lead exposure, you go all the way back thousands of years, and then you see a little bump during the Roman period. We always think the Romans were killed off by lead, and they did have a little bit more lead than the previous populations, but nothing like medieval time. Now, another study that I saw published, because I was curious where we are now today, shows that in this last century, we're between 1 and 2 micrograms or milligrams per kilogram of lead in our teeth. So we brought it down from the Middle Ages, but we're still very high compared to where we should be. There's a lot of people that regulate lead in the United States. They basically have no agreement on anything. They're all subject to political whims and and funding. But basically you have OSHA, which is the occupational health group that talks about workers, and it's by all means woefully out of date. The FDA, that looks at consumer products and how much lead they can have. The Consumer Product Safety Commission, the CDC, which looks at blood lead, and the EPA, which is supposed to be our Environmental Protection Agency. The one thing they do agree on is a categorization called NOEL, or no observable effect level, that lead is not a horrible toxicant. And the CDC, the ASDR, and the EPA all agree on that. They don't agree on numbers and amounts and all that, but they all agree that there is no toxic threshold for lead. And that means there's no measurable lead in the body below which harm does not occur. OSHA's inhaled limits are like 50 micrograms per cubed of air over in 8 hours. If you have more exposure than that, you need a respirator. But they're also the ones that say greater than 20 micrograms per deciliter of blood over 2 months and separate readings is okay. And we all know that that's way, way too high now. The CDC lowered the micrograms of lead per deciliter in children last May. It was 10 for the last decade. This allowed 500,000 U.S. children to be considered lead toxic. And there's a difference between lead health effects and lead toxicity, and the CDC actually level is now 5, the international level is 10, and it's still less than 10 for adults. But if you look back, in the 60s it was 60, in the 70s it was 30, and we brought it down quite a bit, and now it's 5. It probably should be, you know, less than 1. But those are the rules. FDA regulates, they have action levels on ceramics and hollowware and bottled drinking water, and you can see what those, if you ever need a reference, these are the current levels. The NIH normative aging study, was one of the main keynote people is Howard Hu, and he's now with Michigan, but he was with the NIH group for over 10 years at Harvard. And they assembled a mini monograph that you should read sometime, and it basically shows that adult lead exposure causes mostly cardiovascular and cognitive problems as it leaches out of your bone 4 to 10 times faster when you hit 40 to 80. And the other comment is that the lead standards of the OSHA Health Administration are woefully out of date given the growing evidence of the health effects of lead. And this was 5 years ago, and even the recommended things that they were talking about then have now been proven to be woefully out of date. So it just gets worse and worse, even the lower and lower lead levels go, whether it's bone measurements or blood levels, there's always, you know, a health effect. Now, in the world right now, there are 2 major disasters going on. And you keep hearing, probably in your little environmental daily thing, the lead poisoning disaster going on in Nigeria. In 2010, gold was discovered in northern Nigeria, and these people who had no money had their kids, their grandmas, their pets out breaking every rock they could find in this one area to get gold. And they've kind of hushed up the number of people affected, but at least 400 children have been reported killed. 69,000 adults are toxic. Over 1,000 children need chelation, according to the Doctors Without Borders. And they have had blood lead levels from 10 to 700, which I didn't even know you could survive. And their soil, which they just last month finished remediating in big pits, was 35,000 parts per million. And it's around 400 parts per million upper limit in the United States. So this was a true lead poisoning situation. These kids don't go to school, they worked in the mine, they were covered with dust. This little girl is blind in one eye. When she's happy, she can move her tongue. When she's upset, she screams, and one of her eyes is blind. Every time she wakes up, she has convulsions. the second major place right now that is not only exporting lead, but has a major poisoning toxicity going on, is the #1 battery maker in the world, and these are lead smelters. And that's lead just going right out into the environment. There's over 10 communities or states that have, provinces that have had anywhere from 5 to 1,000 major toxicity in children reported. They've gone as far as closing these factories and then reopening them. Well, they're closed, but all of a sudden the smelting is still going on. So government officials are still running it, even though they politically say that they've closed the factories. But this is a major thing. Also, rice imported from China was recently found to be loaded with lead. And of course, you have the consumer agencies and the FDA are looking at imports because especially the red pigments have tons of lead in them. And so it's enough that if the kid licks them or touches them or the dust as it wears off gets in, that they are a major source of toxicity. And not to forget, remember the condors and the eagles in the 70s that were killed by DDT? Well, right now we're back down to that level again. We have major lead poisoning in our predatory animals because people hunt, they shoot the animals eat the lead shot. That's a picture of you know, something in the predator's gut, and as you can see, it's lead. And this is a deer, or maybe it's not a deer, it's some sort of animal that this is a picture of what's in there, and the bullet, when it hits, you know, shatters and fragments, and so your deer meat or animal meat is full of lead by X-ray diffraction. So you have to be very careful, but there's a thing going on to change lead bullets for hunting to copper. And I like that. How many times should a bullet kill? There are copper bullets now that can be used instead of lead, and we need to change to that. Then we come to the United States, and we have something called partial pipe replacements, and this was the reason that Washington, D.C. was totally contaminated in 2001. As you can see, when water comes from the main, from the treatment plant, it's completely clean of lead. But when it gets to where it goes into your house, that's the partial replacement. And a lot of people can't afford that. A lot of older communities have not replaced it. And if a community gets over 10% of the people that have lead at a certain level that keeps going down and down, then they have to economically participate in the partial pipe replacement, even if the people can't. Well, what happened in D.C. was in the first half of 2001, 0.5% of people had the toxic lead level at the time, which was 10. Then, because of worries about chlorine and contamination and chlorine chemicals, they changed to a chloramine system, and they shot chloramine in the pipes. Well, chloramine unleashed lead like crazy. And in the second half of 2001, of course, they didn't know this going on in real time, but the second half of 2001, 5% of the entire Washington area had children that were in the toxic level for lead. Now, the action level for these utilities, according to the EPA, is 15 parts per billion. In Washington, 1 in 6 houses had greater than 100 parts per billion. 1 in 1,000 houses had greater than 1,000 parts per billion. And at 10 micrograms of IQ, or at 10 micrograms of lead, IQ in children drops 5 to 7 points. Now, Washington was the place that this was going on, but it was proposed and maybe was going on in other places in the United States. If you projected this on the nationwide level, there would be 3.5 million additional children classified as mentally retarded based on that one event. That's pretty bad. This is going to probably be a movie, and I don't usually source Wikipedia as a source, but they've got a 6-page, wonderfully documented. It has everything from environmental health perspectives. It has the whole debacle. And if it wasn't for the Washington Post that won some great awards for fleshing this thing out, the lady at Wasu, the water district, who was the first person who brought this up, got fired because of her insistence. The EPA guy that was doing the studies got called and threatened with his job. George Washington University professor who published an article in Environmental Health Perspectives that, it was okay if all of a sudden 5% of the kids, had lead toxicity because no damage had been done. It took 5 years to get the lead levels back down. Their congressional had a big review, and they slapped the CDC because they published in the weekly morbidity and mortality study that it was okay. There was a class action. I mean, it's just got all the players of what happens when somebody tries to uncover an environmental disaster. And a lot of the people were trying to hide the houses that had the highest ones so they wouldn't have to pay for that minimum, number of houses. Anyway, it was a mess, and it's a good read if you want to read something. Now back to Washington with biosludge. Okay, biosludge. In the 1970s, we had the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, and so sludge at the wastewater treatment plants has not only lead and cadmium and mercury and every other toxin in the world, including dioxins and just horrible stuff. It's this gray sludge. Well, they were dumping it in the ocean because nobody knew what to do with it. They renamed it biosolids and said it was organic stuff you could put on your lawn. So in the 80s, we started sludging lawns as fertilizer with this biosludge that was full of lead. And even in Houston, we had Houston actinide, and from Milwaukee, we had milorganite, and naturally nutrient-rich, organic, slow-release organic fertilizer. But the USDA specifically forbids biosludge to be used on farms that do label their produce as organic, so that's a good thing. But anyway, so how does that come into play? Well, a few years ago when Michelle Obama decided to plant a garden to get kids to, eat vegetables, they tested the soil, which had been sludged since the 80s, and found like 93 parts per million of lead, which of course was way over the amount that you can have. And so they did some things to lower the pH and take the lead levels down so that they could plant their garden. The people that are, it's not only people, it's your family pets that are close to the ground that inhale a lot of dust. They dig in dirt and bones and all that kind of stuff. And so the veterinarians have the same symptoms to watch for in their dog, which are, again, mostly GI and neurocognitive type things. So if you see these sorts of symptoms in your household pets, and in Galveston, we really have to worry about that because we have so many old historical homes that they have to change the topsoil on the playgrounds every couple of years because of the amount of lead that the kids are exposed to. So you can imagine what your dog's exposed to. Now, how did lead get so big in the United States? Well, it was in gasoline and paint. And the history of the gasoline story is that Thomas Migley, which I believe was a Yalie, he's an engineer who dabbled in chemistry, and he decided to put organic lead into gasoline. And organic lead just means it has ethyl or methyl groups attached to it, so it's very much more toxic to humans because it infiltrates places that it otherwise wouldn't. When it was first introduced into gasoline, it was called Looney gas because everybody at the Bayport plant in New Jersey ended up in the psych ward, died, or you just went crazy. And this guy's also responsible for the fluorocarbons that we all got rid of because they were burning up the ozone layer. He stood out in front of people and washed his hands with ethyl gas and said it can't hurt anybody. And then later they found out that he had just gotten back from Europe and had like 6 months of treatment for lead toxicity. But anyway, his untimely death came around from being strangled in a bed of pulleys he invented for turning polio victims, and he developed polio and used the invention, and it killed him. So he was a chemist that probably shouldn't have been. Then there was Claire Patterson, who was an Iowa boy who went to University of Chicago, and he was just a geologist, he was trying to use uranium to age the Earth, and before they'd done carbon dating, and so we all knew the Earth was 4 billion years old, and so when his tests with uranium, no matter where he went in the world, showed it was 8 billion, it was because that's when they realized that the environment was contaminated worldwide from probably all the gas being blown in the air. And it all resulted in a long story, but he's the one that came up with the Clean Air Act of 1970, and he continued to do, environmentally active things based on the lead, and ultimately got the removal of lead from gasoline in 1986. And the Ethel Corporation kept trying to buy out his contracts at different universities, including University of California, but they never got rid of him, and so his persistence paid off for the betterment of our U.S. society. Now, lead in paints is kind of an interesting thing, because I think DuPont was a friend of the people that owned Ethel Corporation, and I think that was one of the places that it really got added later on. But in the early 1900s, hundreds of millions of people had died from infectious disease, and at the time the medical community encouraged people to wash their walls. Well, so painted walls became preferable over wallpaper, because wallpaper, released arsenic and it harbored bacteria, and it's hard to wash wallpaper. And so until lead was removed from paint in the mid-70s, we had a whole, 50, 60 years of everybody was using white lead in the paint, and then that dust would, affect the kids. And because even in the 20s, when all this started, nobody had indoor plumbing, so they weren't getting it from the water, they were getting it from the paint in their house. Now, you don't have to have a $2 million NIH grant. You can just be a Roman hermit and see what lead poisoning does to people. This was a translated description of lead poisoning by a hermit in times of Rome, and I thought it was pretty funny. Hence, gout and stone afflict the human race, lazy jaundice with her saffron face, palsy with shaking head and tottering knees, bloated dropsy, the staunch Sot's disease, consumption, pale, with keen but hollow eye and sharpened feature, showed that death was nigh, and the feeble offspring cursed their crazy sires, and tainted from his birth the youth expires. Well, children, I mean, this just sums it up so beautifully. Now, where do we get the proven health findings with lead? Okay, so most of these things come from the NIH normative aging study. 44% of cataracts, how many teeth you lose as you get older, was published, I think, last year. How strong your bones are is related to how much lead has accumulated in your bones. Peripheral vascular disease, coronary artery disease, EKG changes, and even I put in the little formula for gout, because lead stops up one of these, and they used to call it Saturn gout, but gout, shrinkage of brain on MRIs and cognitive studies, kidneys, especially in diabetics, are terribly affected by the amount of lead that's in your bone. So the NIH normative aging studies are very interesting from an epidemiological point of view. But who would know that 44% of cataracts in the United States, the leading cause of blindness, are due to the amount of lead in your bones? So even though we've got hardly any lead left in our blood in most places in the United States, we still have 90 to 95% of all the lead we've ever been exposed to sitting in our bones, coming out at a rate of 4 to 10 times faster than normal starting at age 40. Most of the symptoms from both chronic and acute are neurological, gastrointestinal, and cardiovascular. They sound like my waiting room, which they are. Now, again, let's go through the toxicology of bone versus blood. Blood levels, which are like the CDC NHANES, reflect the last 30 to 60 days of exposure. approximately 50% comes from the bone and 50% comes from the environment. In pregnancy, up to 80% of the blood levels can be from bone storage, which is bad news for the kids in Galveston County that have been exposed to huge amounts, even as recently as 5 years ago, of lead levels up to 20 on an average in this 1 square mile area. But anyway, that's the CDC in Haines, and they use blood level in their epidemiological analysis. The bone levels predict long-term health outcomes: vascular, renal, neurological, cataracts, hypertension, bone, how many teeth you have, the slide we just went through. They measure the bone by using this special bone density machine that, instead of using whatever, M shell, uses K shell fluoroscopy, and they measure cortical bone, which is long-term bone, and trabecular bone, which is short-term, like soft tissue storage. Currently, you can mobilize lead from bone with EDTA challenge or a DMSA challenge. They both predict bone stores, but not as good as the K-shell fluoroscopy. So we have a wonderful technology. We just can't buy it unless you just want to go spend $100,000, and they'll build it for you. Now this is what, if you go to in Haines and you look at, we're now on the 4th in Haines, and it's over like a period of 10 years. And as you can see, the geometric mean for people has gone from 1.6 to 1.12. Now, when I first started studying this 10 years ago, we were in Haines 3, and the geometric mean then was 2.54. You can see it ranges from up to, 5, now down to 3, and the sample size is pretty good. If you look at the age groups, if you're closer to the ground the first 20 years, you're going to have the highest lead level. So 2, 1.51, 1.1, and then 20 and older involves all the occupational people, so it jumps back up. But the closer you are to the ground when you're young, you have more lead. Males have more than females. Again, I think this is manufacturing and occupational exposure. And children, of which now there are 500,000 because of the recent lowering of the levels to 5 being toxic. Kids absorb 70% of lead, adults absorb 20. A lot of times no one knows the kid is having symptoms. They can't speak, but it leads to learning disabilities, behavioral problems, malformed bones, growth retardation. At higher levels can cause seizure, coma, and death. And the source is still lead-based paint dust, drinking water from those partially replaced pipes, contaminated food. Usually the food is like from Mexico or India or China, and then soil and toys that the kids are sucking on. So one of the things you can do is wash the kids' hands and be very cautious of what toys you bring in the house. You can buy a lead detector at Lowe's and scrape it on things and look at your windowsills and look at your water and look at your kids' toys if there's any question. Now this I thought was extremely interesting. Everybody knows that lead leads juvenile delinquency and dropouts and all this stuff. This is actually back to 1876, and there is a 21-year lag of the murder rate going up behind lead. And so they plotted it out for the last century and a half, and every time lead goes up, 21 years later, the murder rate goes up. There's a 23-year lag on violent crime, and that's been done since the mid-1930s. And yes, lead causes pregnancy. But actually, teenage pregnancy trends have a 15-year lag behind lead, and that's also been since the mid-30s. So I guess that's the female juvenile delinquency equivalent. So again, where does lead come from? Air, water, And you have to be careful of those lead-free brass fixtures because they're 5 to 7% lead. Imports, medicine, vinyl mini blinds are always, prior to 1996, I don't know who still has mini blinds that are still hanging from before 1996, but watch out if you do. And of course, cosmetics, particularly your red cosmetics. And if you're like soft vinyl lunch boxes, were found to have 90 times more candy imported from Mexico, especially ice cream and things like that. And in California have had some really bad hits. This imported jewelry thing from Reebok was on about 10 years ago, and a couple kids swallowed them and died. And the other thing is we still use leaded gas on the farm and in aviation and racing cars and boats for whatever reason, and that's still present. And then there's grandma's lipstick. Sorry, I'm a new grandma. I just thought that was so cute. But be careful of kissing the kid with red lipstick. And lead in your wine. This is really scary because you're supposed to have the amount limited for drinking water is 50 parts per billion. And in domestic wines versus foreign wines, I mean, there's still anywhere from 673 parts per billion in domestic and up to almost 2,000 in some imported wines. So be careful of your wines. The occupations that are at the highest risk are electricians, plumbers, painters, munition specialists, paint and ink. And if you look at this, and this is the workers that have the blood lead levels greater than 25. Manufacturing is the biggest, but greater than 25, that's terrible. And this is the number of workers with blood lead levels equal to 20 to 40 detail, and the red here is the 40s. So again, it's who finishes the outside of the buildings and plumbing, things like that. How do you get it out of your body? Well, remember, 90 to 95% is retained, and into the bone it goes, where it turns over slowly. A third of what's left goes into the bile, the gastric fluid, and saliva. Renal excretion is the majority of the rest, but you can also sweat it out. So if you've got people doing saunas and hydrotherapy and things where they sweat, this is definitely another way of a proven way to get lead out of your body. When it's deposited in soft tissues, autopsy studies show that the liver is the largest repository of soft tissue lead, followed by the kidney. And so, again, those elevated liver function tests may not all be from alcohol, or maybe it's from the lead that's in the alcohol, but it can definitely cause elevated liver functions and fatty liver. So in the NIH studies, as you get older, it's the populations at risk for lead toxicity from increased bone turnover that have the most problems. So you're looking at andropause and menopausal women, hyperthyroidism, so those people that want to take a little bit too much thyroid, it turns their bone over faster. People that go through chemo, particularly the cisplatin type chemos, people with osteoporosis or osteopenia and vitamin D deficiency, which is approximately 50% of the population. And on the genetic studies that I have talked about in various ACAM talks, the VDR gene determines how fast you turn over cortical bone, which is the long-term storage bone. And so vitamin D deficiency is a major problem here. So in my approach for the last 15 years has been to stop the bones from turning over. So, I'll do anything I need to on these old people that have crumbly bones. I mean, including putting them on bone osteoporosis bone meds. I found that my average population now used to be like 5 to 10 micrograms of lead, and now they're much lower compared to when I do a health fair out in the local place, and I get all these people with really high lead levels. But my population now that I've done all these things to try and get their bones not to turn over. Calcium, lead will slip in where calcium is in the bone, and so if you have high calcium levels through eating a lot of greens and bioidentical sources of calcium, which actually greens have a lot more than milk and all the things we tell people to eat, that you can get your lead not to deposit so much in the bones if you have a high calcium level. So that's a good thing. Lots of calcium. Now, this was an NHANES, again, a blood lead study, and it was from the previous NHANES. It was NHANES 3, when lead, the average lead level, or the geometric mean, was 2.54, which they had no idea at the time when they did the study, or they would have gone down lower, that was going to be such a big deal. And I loved it when I saw this editorial, low-level environmental exposure to lead unmasked as silent killer in U.S., and it was in circulation. And basically what it showed was that blood levels as low as 2, which 38% of the U.S. population had, were at high risk for cardiovascular events. And they put it into 3 groups: the highest tertile versus the middle tertile. It was 2.5 times the risk for stroke. The middle was 1.51 compared to the lowest. And so you can see these huge mortality risks. Okay, so this is up there with cholesterol and hypertension, but yet nobody talks about it. Well, then, 3 years later, the NIH published the equivalent study, but using bone lead. And again, it was 6 times in the second tertile, and I think almost 8 times, 800% increase in cardiovascular death if you were in the upper tertile, and about 600 if you were in the middle. Now these findings were dramatic. It's the first time that we have a biomarker of cumulative exposure to lead. And it's like the blood lead is the tip of the iceberg, and the iceberg is in your bones. And so as you get older, even though we don't have, current exposures are low right now, past exposures are what kill you. And so we really have to identify that top tertile and keep those bones safe and reduce the amount of lead that's in the soft tissues available to wreak havoc. Now, I'm not going to go through every study that was ever done, but the first set of studies that were done with blood and the NHANES things was lead and hypertension, and systolic versus diastolic. And there's no doubt that the very first thing, and this was in 2003, the very first thing that happens when people hit age 40 is that they start turning over their bones lead faster, and that idiopathic hypertension now is no longer idiopathic. 95% of it is due to, between ages 40 and I think 62, 95% of it is due to excess bone lead. I'm sorry, yes, excess bone lead, because it leaks into the blood. Tibial bone, which is the cortical bone, and blood lead levels predict 17, almost 18 times worsening of serum creatinine over time in diabetic hypertensives. Now, there's always, well, does treatment help? And the New England Journal in 2003 had this landmark article. This guy down here that I referenced, Jay Lynn, he has published 5 articles. The first one was in '99 in Annals, and it was the same study except just a little higher level of lead. And what they did was, in Taiwan, they took all these people that were, the OSHA level was 600 micrograms per 24 hours of lead. And so what they basically did was they took people with 80 and on a chelated specimen. And what they did was they watched them for a couple years, and they're not getting any treatment here, just both groups. Their serum creatinine is going down rapidly. They treat them between here and here. Boom, these people go back up to baseline from the beginning of the study. These people go on down to eventual dialysis. Now, if you want a cost-effective study, you look at that, and it costs about almost $4,000 to chelate these people, but it costs $61,000 to treat their renal failure with hemodialysis. So that's a 95% reduction in potential cost if you will treat the lead. And so this is the first best group of chelation data that shows here's a problem. If you chelate the lead out, there is an economic benefit as well as a, an end point here that you can look at. And now he's done 5 more of these, and down to levels between 20 and 40 micrograms on a chelated 24-hour specimen, which is not even considered lead toxicity or any place close to it, and he gets the exact same thing. So the question is it the EDTA or is it the lead? And that's a very interesting question, and I'll go into it more in a future talk. But there's this thing called nitric oxide, which is what makes cells open up and keeps your blood flowing. It's kind of like your nitroglycerin. They won the Nobel Prize for it in the 90s. But lead, depending on the concentration, inhibits nitric oxide. And so you have decreased renal function, the increased amount of lead that you have. And when you use the EDTA, you increase it. So I didn't understand it at the time when they said, well, we're not sure that it's the lead removal, but we do know that it's the EDTA chelation, absolutely, that lowers the, that causes the outcome. So that was an interesting thing, because will the same thing happen if you use DMSA? Is it really from lowering the lead, or is it from increasing the nitric oxide, and is all of that due to removing lead, or does EDTA have a nitric oxide effect on itself? Which the answer is probably, and I'm doing a study with Nathan Bryan, who's part of that lab in Houston that won the Nobel Prize, to look at chelation patients and measure their nitric oxide levels. So that's probably going to start later this year. Okay, so this is an interesting study. These are rats that don't even have lead, who were treated with EDTA 30 minutes before their renal arteries were clamped. They were clamped, and then they measured the inducible nitric oxide, the MAC adhesion things, the TNF-alpha, and the bottom line was in pre-treated rats, they preserved the morphology. They didn't have problems. Their NO was fine. Their MAC adhesion coefficients were fine, and they didn't have all the inflammation of the TNF-alpha. So it also looks at another study to show that EDTA, which is a chelator, preserves the nitric oxide and may be very protective, even in lead or unleaded mice. So again, part 2 of the series is going to be, I'm going to review, because there's a lot of questions out there, and the studies aren't all that good as far as the different chelators. But these are the official chelators in the world, and for arsenic, lead, mercury, and what they're used for, and the reference. I forgot to put the reference on here, but anyway, these are the chelators that we can use to get rid of lead. Here it is. This is a great review article of all the chelators that are used, how to use them, and if you just put this PubMed code in your Google, it'll bring up the article, and this is who it's by. But anyway, they go through all the different combinations, why you should, and this is something that you should go to ACAM or take a course, and because it's not just something, oh, here, I'm going to go get some EDTA or some DMSA and treat these people. It's really it's a complex set of mechanics. Now, lead is what they call a straight line kinetic. You give it, it goes down in a straight line. But there's other ones that hide in folded molecules, and like mercury. You could chelate somebody 6 times in a row and measure the dumping each 6 times in a row, and you get different amounts that go way up and down. But lead is pretty straight line kinetic, and so there's a lot of complicated things involved in how to treat these people for metal intoxication. And this is brilliant. This, sometimes the simplest thing is the best. So how do you get rid of all that lead on that soil, on the schoolyard, or how do you protect the kid? How do you remediate an area that's full of lead? Well, it turns out that lead binds to the apatite in fish bones, and the apatite in fish bones is not absorbable. So a kid could stick a big chunk of dirt and dust in their mouth, and it'll go right through them, because that lead will not release in that kid's gut. And the interesting thing is, in about 2 weeks, you can go from a 0.28 milligram per liter in the soil to 0.00085 milligrams per liter. And they have done experimental cleanups in Oakland, California, and New Orleans after Katrina, cleaning up this mess. So I just think that there's lots of fish bones out there, and this could be a really simple, cheap way to protect our kids. The bottom line, and the thing you should walk away with, avoid current exposure. And for all those people that were couldn't avoid it back when we were kids because we didn't know better, keep your bones strong, take vitamin D, eat bioidentical calcium, exercise, do what you feel about your hormones, but keep your bones from turning over, and you will hopefully avoid the epidemiologically proven problems of aging, which is your waiting room.